Mr Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Mid Dorset and North Poole for securing this important debate. I think sometimes we don't get into the nitty-gritty of the stories behind the statistics, and so that's what I'd like to focus on today. I want to focus my remarks in particular, as you would expect from a Plymouth MP, on the experience of Plymouth, which, as we know, is the centre of the world. But I want to also delve into a bit about looking at the statistics not in isolation, but as part of a basket of measures. Because I think there needs to be greater focus on not one raw indicator, standing in isolation, but the broader picture if we are to safeguard job creation, stability and quality of employment that we all want right across the country. Now, unemployment statistics are only one part of the picture, and if I'm honest, I'm always a bit cautious about government statistics, be that under the coalition, this government, or indeed when Labour was in power, because they are designed to tell one part of the story only. Now, while the overall jobless figures may be falling, and that is to be welcomed, in-work poverty is rising, insecure employment is rising, zero-hour contracts are rising, food bank use is up, the housing crisis is continuing, and the welfare system continues to be cruel, creating all too often examples of poverty and worry where it should be achieving the opposite. Happy to.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, and he'll forgive me, I think, for interrupting him so early on in his remarks. But just to take him back to what he said about government statistics, and I agree we should be cautious and have a healthy scepticism about statistics, but of course these are ONS statistics, these are not government statistics, and therefore perhaps we can lend greater weight than otherwise the sceptical public might.
And that's a good point that he has made there. I think that how statistics are presented by government sometimes can devalue some of the credibility that the original source may provide. And I think there is examples that we can all think of in how that could be that we can bring to mind here. However, when going on to statistics, I'm a great believer of the way that inflation is calculated. And if honourable members will indulge me just a second, inflation is calculated by taking a basket of measures of everyday goods and calculating the inflation rate based on the real-world experience of many measures, many goods, not just one of them. In that sense, a basket of measures can create a fuller, more thorough illustration of what is actually happening. Now, the reality gap between individual employment statistics and the lived experiences, especially for young people, is one that I think a basket of measures would help address much more thoroughly than just focusing on jobless figures or any other singular reality. So what I suggest is that when we look at how we talk about unemployment statistics, employment statistics, debt, we look at a basket of measures, which I think needs to include employment, wages, wage growth, levels of in-work poverty, levels of child poverty, homelessness, temporary housing as well as disposable income, the number and penetration of zero-hour contracts, especially their demographic targeting, benefit take-up, sanction levels, household debt, overall personal indebtedness. And perhaps this could be wrapped in together to be a new basket of measures where we can look at the lived experience of people in employment. Because all too often the idea that someone is in a job and there is a ticker beside it is presented by governments of all colours. And we know the lived experience of those people in work, especially in today's economy, where simply having a contract does not guarantee you're going to get any wages at the end of that week or end of that month, is something that devalues some of the credibility that those same jobless figures or employment figures may have carried in the past, where employment was more secure and long-term. But we know that that's not the case anymore. Happy to.
I thank the honourable friend for giving way, and he's making a very important point. I thank the honourable gentleman opposite for bringing up this debate. Does he agree with me that in the way he's discussing this basket of measures, that one of the things that you'd want to establish, if it was a business you were looking at, is just a number of hours being worked by those in work, i.e. the available number of hours or days available to work, which could be one of the measures that we actually have significant underemployment in this country, and that rather than being a jobs miracle, it's something of a jobs mirage.
Well, I think my honourable friend has a way with words when it comes to that. But I have to say, I think looking at that as part of that basket of measures, I think could well be useful. Indeed, if we were to look at the number of jobs individuals have as well, Because although we've seen perhaps a rise in people with contracts, many of those contracts are part-time contracts. And certainly the experience that people in Plymouth have been telling me about is of needing not just one job, but 2 jobs, 3 jobs, in some cases 4 or 5 jobs, because of the level of insecurity of those jobs and the hours they provide to make the bills pay. So I think the contribution of all those together, I think, would make a more informed value judgment about the state of the economy. Now, in recent years, we've seen a rapid shift towards the gig economy. And despite calls for an end to zero-hour contracts, many are still struggling with the precarious nature of these contracts. Now, there are some people that value zero-hour contracts. My fear about what has happened with the zero-hour contracts debate is the utility for that small group of people has been taken over by employers using it as a way of being more flexible with their workforce, more flexible with their cash flow. And the consequence of that has been that that utility that may have come to a small number of individuals from that workplace flexibility has been eroded by the fact that it's being used to devalue secure work. Now, before I came to this place to debate, I posted on my Facebook page, which, if anyone hasn't visited, facebook.com/Luke-Pollard, and I asked people what their experience was. So I'm going into the debate to talk about employment statistics. Can you tell me your stories? And normally on my Facebook page, I have a few regular posters, as I'm sure members with Facebook posts will know themselves. But what struck me about the response to this post was how personal, how emotional, and how honest people were in telling me their experiences. And if you haven't done that yourselves, I encourage you to do that on your own post, because it helps create a fuller picture. Some of the examples that people gave. Erin, one of the constituents, is a qualified secondary school teacher who's been forced to take zero-hours contracts by an employment agency for the past 3 years. Despite years of training, she told me she was struggling to find permanent work, which has subsequently impacted her ability to pass the tenancy checks required for private renting. And Plymouth Sutton Devonport has 43.5% private renters, which shows just how important that could be. Erin now plans to leave the teaching profession for good and will be retraining in September. One example of someone that we need to retain in those roles with more secure work. Melanie was another example. She's worked for 3 years at the Royal Mail in Plymouth. She was on a fixed-term 20-hour contract that was reviewed every 6 months. As a single parent, she spoke of the stress that this uncertainty brought, as she could never be sure that she would still have a job once the end of her contract rolled around. While Melanie has managed to secure permanent employment elsewhere now, her story is not uncommon. And it's those types of lived experiences that I think are the stories behind the statistics. The frequency of needing to go to get another interview, to get that extra hour. And then the concern and worry that what happens if an employer wants their hours to coincide with another employer's hours. Now, these are types of concerns that perhaps many in this room might not have experienced themselves, but is a genuine worry for so many people up and down the country that is adding to the complexity and the inequality within our system as it is at the moment. Now, colleagues will know of the problems that universal credit has made to this system. And indeed, the House of Commons Library point out that because of the rollout of universal credit, which is in part of the area that I represent, but not all of it, it skews the jobless figures for this period. And so looking behind those figures is actually a little bit more complex and complicated than it might have been before universal credit was rolled out. And I think I would ask the Minister whether there is a way of navigating through that complexity and that added dimension to look at what the underlying picture is, because the rollout of UC complicates that in terms of being able to get an accurate sense of where we are. Now, universal credit for many is failing them, and we know the experiences that have been shared in this chamber and elsewhere. Our benefit system shouldn't allow people to spiral into more debt, and I'm concerned about the sustainability of this system in its current form. But the concerns around UC and the rollout onto UC, especially for those people in insecure work, although they may not be on the jobless figures that the government provides, is something that I think needs to be addressed. But we also need to look at in-work poverty, because fundamental, I believe, to most people's beliefs as to why they entered politics in the first place, be that on the red team or on the blue team, is to make the world a better place. The only disagreement I perhaps have with colleagues on the other side is how to do that. And actually, in-work poverty should be something that is an anathema, both from a Labour Party perspective and a Conservative one, and indeed other parties as well. Because we all aspire to help people into work so they can provide for their own families through the hard works of their own labour. Now, if you are in work and still unable to provide for your family, something is wrong with our economy. And we know that that is the case in Plymouth and elsewhere at the moment, because we're seeing a rise in food bank use. Now, I hope that there will be one day where we don't need food banks again. And the fantastic volunteers that staff the food banks at the moment can be redeployed into other endeavours. But I know that food bank usage is going up, and from having seen the work of the fantastic soup kitchens and soup runs in Plymouth, I know that the demand is getting more and more, not just from rough sleepers, but those people in insecure work, temporary accommodation, who can't make ends meet and struggle to feed themselves and their families. If you haven't been out on a soup run, I highly recommend it. For members of Parliament and those perhaps watching at home, it is an eye-opener to the lived experiences of those people that live in your communities who you may not see during the day, but for whom, when you hand out a pasty or a banana from the back of an old transit, as we do every now and then in Plymouth, the stories and the gratitude that comes from that, because it is a real humbling experience to see people who, in many cases, are now in work, but still struggling to make ends meet. I think we need safeguards to help those struggling to break into the job market in permanent employment, as well as those who are in the job market to make sure that work can truly pay. Because at the moment, that's not where we are at the moment, and especially this is true for those people with disabilities. Joe, one of the constituents I represent, working in the employment sector, has told me that the job opportunities advertised for students and graduates often involve temporary contracts with low-skilled roles, which he struggles to be able to get. Similarly, Matt from Plymouth shared his experience of having high-functioning autism and described his job search as impossible. Now, that is something that should shame us all in terms of how we do it, and actually is a challenge for us about how we present job adverts, where they're done, what the employment process is to get to that point, as well as the jobs themselves. I'm concerned the lack of opportunities is impacting people in Plymouth on a personal and economic level, and we must act to contain the ongoing effects, not only of unemployment, but underemployment, and the impossibility of getting it in many cases. Now, members will know of my desire to talk about transport, and occasionally I talk about trains in this place, but the connectivity for the far southwest is a complicating reason in the economic performance of Plymouth and the wider southwest economy, as it is for many other parts of the country. The investment that we need in structural transport, both on road and rail, and bus services within a city, can open up and transform job opportunities. And I want to for a moment just talk about buses, because when we're looking at underemployment, one of the concerns that a number of people who approach me have told me about is that without a car, they're sometimes unable to get to their workplace because there's no public transport available, because the buses stop at a certain time. Now, this is especially true of sometimes low-wage service work, and indeed, I remember talking about our hospitality sector, for those people who need to get to shops, tourist attractions, cafes and restaurants early in the morning to provide sleepless people with their coffees on their way to work, that actually, without decent public transport, it is impossible for them to get there. And the worrying concern about what that means is that some people are spending their already low wages on taxis to get to work before the working day has started, eroding the value of their day's work for them. I think there is an awful lot that we need to do to look behind the stories, to look behind the statistics. And I'd encourage the Minister to look at whether a basket of measures could be more appropriate. Now, to a certain extent, the debate as to what goes in that basket of measures, just as the debate as to what goes into the inflation measure, is something that tells a story of how our modern day Britain is. And so when we take out one thing, like a record player from the basket of inflation measures, and we put it in an MP3 download, you can see the way the economy is changing. But that same principle, I think, should also apply to how we look at employment statistics and the lived experience of people seeking employment and those in employment. And so I hope one day that we will be able to take out sanctions and food bank use from that basket of measures. I think that should be a collective aspiration for all parties. But until that time, where it's no longer in use, we should feature those as part of that collective basket of stories that human lived experience that sits behind the unemployment statistics. And indeed, there's many other opportunities to add into that, such as mental health provision, which I haven't spoken about, but I hope that colleagues may be able to add to as we go on in this debate. So to the Minister, can I ask whether the Department has considered a basket of measures in terms of how it presents these stories? And can I encourage you all to do, as I did on my Facebook page, try it, get the lived experiences, because it is the most powerful and humbling experience. Thank you.